everyone, welcome back to my channel and welcome to my review of King of Scars. So before I get into this review, I will keep it spoiler free for this book, but I will warn you that there will be spoilers for the Six of Crows duology and the Shadow and Bone trilogy in this review because this book is full of references to those previous series. So if you haven't read those previous series, I would not recommend picking this book up. You will lose a ton of context and what's going on and lose a ton of the character development that was done in those series that continues in this book. So definitely read those series prior to picking up King of Scars. So starting with the summary of this book, this really does pick up where we left off from the Shadow and Bone trilogy, where 3 years have passed and we are now in the perspective of King Nikolai, who is dealing with some of his injuries and things that happened in the final battle in Ruin and Rising and kind of the consequences of that battle in this book. And it really is following his rule of Ravka throughout the entirety of this novel. So it really is so important that you read Ruin and Rising before reading this book. This also has a character from the Six of Crows duology. Nina is present in this book as well, and so it follows her story shortly after the end of Crooked Kingdom. So a couple different perspectives going on, and it very much relies on the previous novels that came before it. I very much want to start off this review talking specifically about the tone of the book, and I know that this is marketed as young adult, just as the Six of Crows duology and Shadow and Bone trilogy was marketed as young adult, but this really leans more towards the older end of that genre. Young adult is a pretty wide genre nowadays because it could also include like new adult books, and I think this definitely leans more adult than it does more young adult, if that makes sense. Very similar to like Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom, where our characters act way beyond their ages and they deal with things beyond just your coming of age stories and that angsty romance. This very much goes much deeper into the politics of this fantasy world, so it feels much more adult than a lot of other young adult series. And I personally loved that about this book because just as an adult, I really liked the themes that were explored. I liked how mature our characters felt and that they already kind of knew who they were. They were confident in themselves. It was just now being faced with these really difficult decisions and how that would play out. So that's the first thing I want to say is if you're looking for a more adult-leaning young adult series, this feels very Six of Crows, Crooked Kingdom, where it's definitely more mature. So where Leigh Bardugo excels in, I feel, all of her stories is really the world building. I think that this world that she's created in the Grishaverse is so fascinating, and with every novel we get more and more of that world expanded upon, which I love. I love how she does her world building, where we don't get paragraphs of exposition, but rather little details sprinkled throughout the text and kind of subtleties that you need to pick up on. I love her world building, and that is definitely present within King of Scars, as well as her dialogue between her characters. This is something that I've always loved in her books, especially books like Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom, but this one really does it well, where our characters have a ton of fun, witty banter between each other, and that's really where you fall in love with the characters, is definitely their dialogue with each other and their relationships with each other, much more than them just kind of having their inner monologues. So I love her dialogue, I love her world building, and both of that is present immensely throughout this book. The standout characters for me in King of Scars were definitely, of course, Nikolai. I loved Nikolai from the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and he definitely is expanded upon as a character in this book in a very believable and real way, but you still love Nikolai, the original Nikolai that you fell in love with in the Shadow and Bone trilogy. So I loved Nikolai, and then the other surprise standout character for me in this book was Zoya. I think that's how you say it, I'm not sure. I loved her character in this. I loved how ruthless and just unapologetic she was. I thought she was an awesome balance to Nikolai, and I loved their banter the most. Anytime they had a scene with each other, I just loved it. So those two were definitely the standout characters. Now, in terms of Nina's character, I liked that she was included in this book. I really liked her from Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. What I felt though with Nina's story in this book is that it was very much separate from Nikolai's story. So it kind of felt like two separate books in one, because when you were reading from Nina's perspective, it was something completely different, a whole different conflict, a whole different cast of characters that you were following. And although it did feel kind of disjointed, where their stories really didn't connect at all within this novel, I can see where Leigh Bardugo is going with Nina's story, I think, and I can see where it could possibly connect in the next book, and I liked it. So even though it feels like kind of these two different stories within this one book, it didn't take away from my reading experience at all. I still really enjoyed it, even though I didn't feel as crazy about Nina's story as I did about Nikolai's and Zoya's. Now, the one thing I'm going to comment on that bumped this down from a 5-star book to a 4.5-star book was the pacing at the very beginning. This took a while to get going, and once it ramped up, you were hooked, but I would say it took about 150 to 200 pages to really get invested in this story and these characters. It's a pretty slow burn at the beginning. So if you can hang in there, push through the beginning where there's just a lot of setup for what's to come, then I promise it's worth the payoff at the end, but definitely know that the pacing at the beginning is very slow. Now, even though the beginning is very slow, the ending is unbelievable. I finished this book today and I had to sit down and record this review because the ending had me shook. Oh my God, I am so excited for the second book now. I almost wish I had not read this book until we had at least a release date or had the second book already out so that I could go ahead and just binge it. I would absolutely, if I had the second book in hand, I would immediately start reading it because this ending, talk about a cliffhanger, it definitely ended with a bang. It wasn't one of those endings though that leaves you angry at how it ended. It ended with just so much excitement and potential that you're just excited at the end. So I wasn't angry at the ending. I wasn't mad at Leigh for giving us this huge cliffhanger. I loved it. I loved how well it was done. So I'm very excited now for the second book. So I almost recommend you wait to read this until the second book comes out because of that crazy ending. Overall thoughts, I was very pleasantly surprised with how much this book really did tie in with both Crooked Kingdom and Ruin and Rising. I don't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't expecting it to tie so closely with those stories and rely so heavily on those events that had happened in those stories. This is not its own new story. This is definitely an expansion upon Ruin and Rising. So keep that in mind if you're going into this book. Do not think of it as its own little compact story. It very much feels like a sequel series to Ruin and Rising, which I was pleasantly surprised about because I personally loved Ruin and Rising. I loved the expansion of the world and the additional lore that we got about this world and kind of its origins and the Grisha powers. I loved all of that. I just ate up the characters and the dialogue between the characters. I think Leigh does such a good job with those nuances. So Definitely recommend this one. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars, almost perfect if it had started the excitement just a little earlier on. It was a slow buildup, but once we got to the main event, so worth it. It was so good. So that was my review of King of Scars. Have you all read this book? What did you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree with any of these thoughts? I'd love to know. So leave your comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And until next time, bye.